It's December 1943, and the Luftwaffe's elite night fighter crews prepare for another routine interception. The officers laugh as they brief, mocking reports of American radar planes. Radar? One scoffs. They barely know how to use it in daylight. Above them, the sky is a deep, endless void, moonless, silent, deceptive. The German crews trust their Würzburg and Lichtenstein radars, confident in the precision of their tracking network. For 3 years, they've ruled these skies, guided by the glow of cathode screens and ground control commands from their Himmelbett sectors. But tonight, something feels wrong. Contact is lost. Blips vanish. Whole bomber streams shift course as if guided by ghosts. When radar stations finally lock on to targets again, it's already too late. Burning wrecks rain down across fields and forests. The Americans have appeared out of nowhere and struck with perfect accuracy and disappeared into the dark. The Germans had laughed at American radar. But in one terrible night, they realized the laughter had died in the static. 1940. Europe burns. The Luftwaffe controls the air over much of the continent, and Hitler's armies march almost unopposed. But across the Channel, a slender chain of tall steel towers begins to change the course of modern warfare. Britain's chain-home radar network, primitive yet revolutionary, detects incoming German bombers long before they reach English shores. For the first time in history, an invisible wave of energy warns of danger before human eyes can see it. The British call it RDF, radio direction finding. To the Germans, it seems like little more than a technical gimmick. Even as they lose hundreds of aircraft over Britain, many officers dismiss radar as a lucky British experiment. They assume victory still depends on pilot skill, not radio waves. In America, far from the Blitz, the phenomenon is being studied with quiet intensity. The U.S. Army Signal Corps and the newly formed Naval Research Laboratory begin experiments on detection through reflected radio energy. But progress is slow. Budget constraints, military skepticism, and limited understanding of shortwave propagation hold them back. Everything changes in 1940 when the Tizard mission arrives from Britain. Inside a small steel box lies an object that will revolutionize warfare: the cavity magnetron. It allows radar to operate at centimeter wavelengths, meaning sharper images, smaller antennas, and, most importantly, airborne radar. American scientists at MIT immediately recognize its power. The U.S. government establishes the Radiation Laboratory, RadLab, inside MIT's campus. Over the next 2 years, more than 3,000 scientists and engineers work around the clock to refine microwave radar for land, sea, and air use. Meanwhile, in Germany, radar development follows a different philosophy. The Luftwaffe relies on ground-based control. Vast radar stations guiding fighters to their targets using voice communication. The Freya and Würzburg systems are considered technological marvels, accurate, reliable, and efficient. The Germans see no reason to risk radar equipment on fragile aircraft when their network already dominates the night. By 1941, the radar war is taking shape in secret laboratories and quiet test ranges. In Britain and America, radar becomes a tool of detection and precision. In Germany, it remains a tool of control and direction. While German physicists like Dr. Rudolf Kuhnhold and Dr. Hans Hollmann refined radar for the Reich, the Allies begin fusing technology with strategy. American engineers at the RAD Lab experiment with airborne interception radar, capable of detecting aircraft several miles away, even in total darkness. They test radar-guided bombing, radar altimeters, and shipborne fire control. But to many U.S. officers in 1941, radar still seems abstract, something for scientists, not soldiers. That perception ends on December 7, 1941. When Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, radar stations in Hawaii detect the incoming wave of aircraft, but the warning is dismissed as friendly bombers. The oversight becomes a national embarrassment and a lesson carved in blood. Technology means nothing without understanding. From that day forward, radar becomes sacred. Funding floods into MIT, Bell Labs, and the Signal Corps. Laboratories hum day and night. Every branch of the U.S. military demands its own version: ground, sea, air, and even portable radar for field operations. The race is no longer theoretical, it's survival. By mid-1942, early American radar systems like SCR-270 and SCR-520 begin deployment. Primitive, yes, but reliable. In the Pacific, they help Marines detect Japanese aircraft approaching island bases at night. In Europe, radar-equipped patrol planes start hunting U-boats in the Atlantic darkness. Germany, still confident in its night fighter system, barely notices. To them, American radar is crude. Their officers joke that Americans use radar like a drunk uses a lamppost for support, not illumination. They don't realize how quickly that lamp is about to blind them. Because inside a lab at MIT, a team led by Dr. Lee Dubridge and Ernest Lawrence has just finished a prototype that will change everything. The microwave airborne radar, small enough to fit inside a bomber's nose, powerful enough to detect an enemy from miles away, and accurate enough to track through storms, smoke, or darkness. The night skies are about to turn deadly. By 1942, radar is no longer a laboratory experiment, it's becoming a weapon. At MIT's Radiation Laboratory, young American scientists, many barely out of graduate school, work around the clock, eating and sleeping in shifts beneath the humming tubes and oscilloscopes. Their mission? To transform the British cavity magnetron into an airborne miracle. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, the first successful microwave radar set, the SCR-520, emerges. It allows American pilots to detect enemy aircraft up to 6 miles away in total darkness. The U.S. Army Air Forces, initially skeptical, begin fitting these units onto experimental bombers and fighters. At the same time, across the Atlantic, the British Royal Air Force shares its wartime secrets with its new ally. The two nations begin a technological partnership that would define Allied superiority. Scientists exchanging notes on radar frequencies, interference patterns, and countermeasure systems. The heart of this cooperation beats inside the Radiation Laboratory, where British and American engineers work side by side. The magnetron becomes the key. Its powerful microwave beam allows radar antennas to shrink dramatically. Suddenly, it's no longer just about ground stations or ship decks. Radar can fly. By late 1942, radar-equipped American bombers begin nighttime patrols over the Atlantic, hunting U-boats. What was once Germany's safest hunting ground becomes a death trap. Submarines that once surfaced freely under moonlight now find themselves ambushed by aircraft they cannot see. Every successful attack is logged. Every U-boat destroyed sends a message. The night no longer belongs to the hunter. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's Himmelbett network still guides night fighters from ground-based radar, but cracks begin to show. The system depends on perfect coordination, every radar station controlling a limited sector, each fighter reliant on verbal instructions. It's efficient on paper, but rigid in reality. One disruption, one jamming signal, one deception, and the entire grid falters. In contrast, American aircraft are learning to fight independently. With airborne radar like AI-Mk4 and later the SCR-720, they no longer need ground guidance. A radar operator sitting behind the pilot can now see through clouds, storms, and night. Each crew becomes its own mobile detection unit, self-contained, self-guided, deadly. The Germans mock this as chaos, blind flying with toys, some officers call it. But soon, these toys will allow US and British bombers to slip through flak belts, navigate directly to their targets, and escape unseen. By mid-1943, the impact is visible across Europe. Luftwaffe night fighter losses rise sharply. U-boat commanders begin reporting mysterious aircraft appearing out of nowhere at night. Ground observers see bombs dropping with impossible accuracy even in fog. In Washington and London, Allied commanders finally understand what they've created. Radar isn't just detection, it's control. It guides fleets through the dark, synchronizes air raids, directs anti-aircraft fire, and even predicts weather patterns for missions. At sea, the U.S. Navy adopts radar across its fleet. Battleships equipped with SG and SK sets can detect incoming aircraft long before lookouts can spot them. Radar-controlled gunnery becomes a new science, shells guided by mathematics rather than eyesight. The Germans notice too late. Their scientists work frantically on countermeasures, radar jammers like Kettenhund, chaff known as duple, and decoys meant to confuse Allied detection. But the Americans are already one step ahead. They develop radar filters, frequency agility, and signal discrimination systems that adapt faster than German intelligence can react. In Europe's night skies, a silent revolution unfolds. The once invincible German radar grid starts to falter. Ground stations report ghost signals, radar interference, and unexplained losses. They don't yet realize it's American microwave radar, invisible to their longer wavelength systems, that's now seeing them while remaining unseen. When the first radar-equipped P-61 Black Widow fighters arrive in 1943, the Luftwaffe is already reeling. Twin-engine, jet black, and deadly silent, these night hunters carry the SCR-720 radar in their noses. They can detect a single aircraft in the dark from miles away, close in unseen, and fire before the enemy even knows they're there. German pilots begin calling them Geisterjäger, ghost hunters, because that's what they are. The laughter that once echoed through briefing rooms starts to fade. For the first time, German officers whispered that the Americans might truly have mastered the invisible. And soon, the skies themselves will prove it.
1. The technological angle. The invisible revolution. Radar wasn't a single invention, it was a symphony of breakthroughs. At the heart of America's radar revolution lay the MIT Radiation Laboratory, a fortress of intellect where physicists, mathematicians, and radio engineers transformed theory into battlefield power. Inside the lab, chalkboards overflowed with equations describing waveforms, signal reflections, and antenna geometry. What began as academic curiosity turned into military urgency. Every small refinement meant more lives saved or taken in the darkness of war. The introduction of the cavity magnetron changed everything. Its microwave output was thousands of times more powerful than previous designs, allowing radar beams to focus sharply and reveal smaller, faster targets. What had once been a blurry echo now became a precise blip. Engineers soon learned how to mount these sets in aircraft, The SCR-520, SCR-720, and AI-MKX became their most advanced systems. Combined with rotating dish antennas and cathode ray displays, they gave pilots eyes in complete darkness. German scientists were brilliant, but their focus remained on long-wavelength radar, unsuited for compact aircraft use. America's leap into microwaves rendered their systems partially blind. The real miracle wasn't just seeing in the dark, it was doing so while the enemy's radar couldn't see you back. Radar became the great equalizer, a technological cloak that turned the night sky from a realm of fear into a calculated arena of precision. 2. The human angle, minds behind the machines. Behind the glowing screens sat ordinary young men who had never imagined they'd fight with mathematics instead of rifles. Many were college physics students, drafted and rushed through crash courses on wave theory and electronics. They became radar operators, the unseen half of the combat crew. Inside bomber noses, destroyer control rooms, and darkened aircraft cabins, they sat hunched over glowing scopes, reading green traces that could mean life or death. Communication between pilot and operator was built on trust. In pitch-black airspace, the radar operator's calm voice guided the pilot through unseen danger. Target bearing 270, closing fast. Range 2 miles, 1 mile. Fire. It wasn't cinematic, it was quiet, disciplined, almost clinical. But that calm guidance was deadlier than any roar of engines. Many of these operators were civilians a year before, engineers from General Electric, students from Caltech, or radio enthusiasts from Chicago. They learned to interpret the faintest flicker on a cathode tube, to distinguish friendly from enemy echoes, and to trust their instruments even when their instincts screamed otherwise. Some called them ghost chasers, others called them wave wizards. But within the Allied forces, they earned another name, the Eyes of the Night. These were the invisible warriors who turned science into survival. They didn't wear medals on their chests or have aces kill counts painted on their aircraft. Yet every interception, every convoy saved, every ambush avoided bore their signature, silent, unseen, precise. 3. The leadership angle, vision in the shadows. Technology alone never wins wars. Leadership, the courage to believe in the unseen, makes it possible. In 1941, when radar was still viewed as an auxiliary tool, a handful of U.S. commanders pushed against skepticism. General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the U.S. Army Air Forces, personally toured the MIT Rad Lab. He saw the flicker of radar waves on an oscilloscope and realized it wasn't science fiction. It was the future of air supremacy. He immediately ordered full-scale production of airborne radar units, even before combat testing was complete. The decision was bold and risky. Many in the military establishment ridiculed the idea of relying on invisible signals. But Arnold wasn't alone. Admirals like Ernest King and Chester Nimitz recognized radar's naval potential early on. They demanded every major ship carry radar by 1943. King even declared, "If it floats, it gets radar." The Navy's insistence on radar control for anti-aircraft batteries and night interception changed the Pacific War. Meanwhile, Dr. Vannevar Bush, head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development, ensured that civilian scientists had unprecedented autonomy and funding. He shielded the MIT Rad Lab from military bureaucracy, allowing rapid innovation without waiting for endless approvals. It was an alliance of minds, generals, admirals, and physicists, each understanding that the future of warfare was invisible. The leadership's true brilliance wasn't just in developing radar, but in trusting it before results were visible. In 1942, radar didn't yet have a proven kill record. It was faith in science that fueled investment. By 1944, that faith had rewritten the balance of the skies. Radar wasn't just an invention, It was the manifestation of belief, in data over instinct, in signal over sight. And while German officers mocked the blind Americans fumbling through radio waves, those very signals were preparing to turn darkness into a trap. The real question was no longer if radar worked, it was how completely it could dominate.
4. The enemy angle. Arrogance in the dark. The German military had entered the radar race early, and with brilliance. Systems like Freya, Würzburg, and Lichtenstein represented cutting-edge 1930s engineering. By 1941, Germany had hundreds of radar installations across Europe, forming a defensive shield that had no rival. To the Luftwaffe's senior officers, radar was already a German victory. They saw their night fighter command, the Nachtjagd, as a model of technological precision. From command bunkers, operators guided twin-engine fighters to their prey, talking pilots towards British bombers detected by ground radar. It worked well until the system was forced to evolve faster than it could. When the Americans began introducing microwave radar, the Germans had no idea what hit them. Their long wavelength systems, operating around 50 centimeters, couldn't detect the shorter Allied frequencies. To them, the new radar waves were invisible, almost magical. Reports from the Luftwaffe night fighter wings grew confused. Enemy aircraft approaching undetected, one commander complained. Radar interference, impossible bearings, attacks from unknown direction. At first, Berlin dismissed these as operator errors. But as the months passed, whole bomber formations were intercepted or evaded without warning. American radar-guided bombing raids slipped past detection grids, while U.S. fighters began ambushing German patrols in the dark. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to adapt, developing radar detectors like Naxos and Flensburg, designed to pick up Allied radar emissions. Yet the Americans changed frequencies faster than German intelligence could track. Every time the Germans believed they had found the signal, it disappeared, replaced by another band. The confidence that had defined the Luftwaffe's early radar mastery turned into frustration, even disbelief. To their minds, this was impossible. How could the Americans, who were still catching up in aviation design, leapfrog them in electronic warfare? But the truth was harsh and simple. While the Germans laughed, the Americans had learned quietly, and then innovated beyond imagination. 5. The strategic angle. The eyes of command. Radar wasn't just a tool of combat. It became the brain of Allied strategy. It transformed how battles were fought, fleets were maneuvered, and air raids were planned. Before radar, nighttime warfare was chaos, guesswork guided by luck and stars. With radar, it became a science. Every Allied bomber stream crossing into Europe was tracked, coordinated, and redirected in real time. Command centers in England watched glowing screens that represented entire squadrons as moving green dots. During the Battle of the Atlantic, radar-equipped Liberator bombers closed the U-boat Black Gap, that deadly zone in mid-ocean where convoys once sailed blind. Now radar eyes scanned thousands of square miles of ocean every night. Within months, U-boat sinkings doubled. By late 1943, Admiral Dönitz himself admitted that radar, not bombs, was destroying his fleet. In the skies over Europe, radar-guided Pathfinder aircraft marked targets with pinpoint accuracy through cloud and smoke. The days of wasted bombing runs were ending. The U.S. 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command coordinated their raids with radar navigation systems like H2X and OBO, able to identify cities by their radar echoes alone. The results were astonishing. Even during overcast conditions, when German spotlights and flak batteries were blind, Allied bombs still found their targets. Factories, rail yards, and oil depots vanished under waves of radar-guided destruction. The Germans tried countermeasures, chaff clouds, duple, false radar returns, even decoy cities. But Allied systems learned to filter out the noise. Each new German deception only trained the American operators to read radar more intuitively. The outcome was decisive. Radar didn't just win battles, it compressed the fog of war. It gave commanders near omniscient awareness: who was flying, where, and when. It removed uncertainty from a war built on chaos. By 1944, radar had become the central nervous system of Allied warfare, a silent command network that stretched from ocean convoys to bomber wings to anti-aircraft stations. And as radar illuminated the world for the Allies, it simultaneously plunged the Germans into darkness. 6. The moral angle. The death of sight. The radar war wasn't fought with emotion. It was fought with data. And that was perhaps its most haunting feature. In the early years, soldiers and pilots still saw their enemies face to face. Combat had a human dimension, the flash of recognition, the split second of fear. Radar erased that. Now men killed based on a glowing green line. A blip appeared, a command was given, and death followed seconds later. It was mechanical, almost sterile. Crews never saw the faces of the men they destroyed. The night sky became an arena of unseen executions. This new detachment changed warfare itself. Many radar operators later confessed to strange feelings of guilt. They didn't feel like warriors. Some said it was like playing God in the dark. Others described the eerie silence after firing, when the radar echo vanished and only static remained. But that detachment was also what made radar warfare so effective. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only signal and response. It marked the beginning of a new kind of combat psychology, one that would define the coming decades of technological war. Decisions made by operators far from the battlefield, weapons guided by invisible systems, life and death determined by mathematics. In the Second World War, radar began that transformation, and in doing so, it forced humanity to confront a new truth, that the deadliest wars are not always seen, but calculated. As German officers struggled to make sense of the invisible war consuming their forces, one realization began to dawn. The Allies had turned the very concept of vision into a weapon. What came next would seal that truth forever, when radar stopped being a defensive tool and became the decisive force of attack.
The night skies over Europe had become a labyrinth of shadows and confusion. For the Luftwaffe, every radar echo was now a question mark. Was it friend, foe, or something unseen altogether? On the ground, the German radar command still believed their Himmelbett network, the canopy bed system, could manage the chaos. Each radar station tracked incoming Allied bombers, guided fighters, and relayed instructions through a chain of radio commands. It was a marvel of organization, but one built for an earlier war, a war of predictable formations and visible enemies. The Americans had rewritten the script. Flying out of bases in England and the Mediterranean, radar-equipped B-24 Liberators and PBY Catalina aircraft scoured the Atlantic night. Their secret weapon was the ASV, Air-to-Surface Vessel Radar, tuned to microwave frequencies invisible to German detectors. U-boats, once confident in their nocturnal invisibility, suddenly began dying in silence. Submarines that surfaced at night to recharge batteries were spotted miles away, even through mist and darkness. Crews barely had time to dive before depth charges exploded around them. For Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, the change was devastating. Reports poured in, attacked without visual contact, aircraft sighted only after bombs released, radar emissions undetectable. The sea that had been Germany's hunting ground was turning into its graveyard. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a breaking point. In May alone, 41 U-boats were sunk, most by radar-equipped aircraft. Donitz called it Black May. He withdrew his submarines from the Atlantic, acknowledging in his own words, quote, that the enemy's technical devices have made continued operations impossible, unquote. The Americans had weaponized invisibility. Meanwhile, in the skies above occupied Europe, radar was rewriting aerial warfare itself. The British had pioneered radar-assisted night bombing, but the Americans were pushing it into precision territory. Their H-2X radar, built upon the British H-2S system, could map cities from 25,000 feet, identifying rivers, rail yards, and factory zones by their unique radar reflections. The Germans called it the blind bomb. They mocked it at first, until it began burning their industrial heartland with unerring accuracy. In August 1943, during Operation Hydra, Allied bombers targeted the Peenemünde research facility, the birthplace of Germany's V-2 rocket program. Clouds and darkness covered the target, yet radar-guided pathfinders marked it precisely. The bombing raid devastated the site, killing key scientists and delaying the V-2 program for months. That night, the German intelligence realized something horrifying. The enemy no longer needed light. For the Luftwaffe's night fighters, it was even worse. Until now, their radar advantage, the Lichtenstein airborne set, had allowed them to stalk British bombers effectively. But the arrival of the American P-61 Black Widow shattered that balance. Sleek, twin-engined, painted jet black, and carrying the advanced SCR-720 radar, the Black Widow could detect a target from 6 miles away, lock on, and close for the kill without ever being seen. For the first time, Germany's night hunters were being hunted. On July 6, 1944, near Paris, a Black Widow from the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron downed a Ju-88 night fighter, a historic first. It was radar versus radar, technology against technology, and the American system proved deadlier. Within weeks, Luftwaffe units began reporting losses without engagement. Their fighters simply never returned. Some had been destroyed before their pilots even knew they were under attack. The shock within German command circles was profound. They had once believed radar to be their exclusive domain, a symbol of their scientific superiority. Now it was a weapon being turned against them with devastating precision. German engineers scrambled to adapt. They introduced new radar systems, SN2, Fuge 220, Fuge 350, each promising to detect the invisible. But the Allies had already deployed radar jammers, window, metallic chaff, and electronic deception units that rendered those systems unreliable.
In late 1943, during a night raid on Hamburg, British and American bombers unleashed the first massive window attack, clouds of aluminum strips designed to confuse radar. German screens filled with hundreds of false echoes, drowning real targets in static. The Luftwaffe's control grid collapsed. To counter it, they needed faster computers, better filters, and higher frequencies, but time was gone. Radar had become the new artillery of the air, invisible, instant, and unstoppable. By the end of 1943, the Americans were tracking every major German movement in the Western theater by radar reconnaissance. Their radar-equipped ships guarded the channel. Their planes ruled the night. Their bombers struck even through blizzards. And the Germans, once the masters of scientific warfare, found themselves fighting ghosts in the dark. Ghosts made of radio waves and mathematics. The war of sight had ended. The war of signals had begun.
By 1944, the radar war had turned from a race of innovation into a desperate scramble for survival. Germany, once ahead, was now buried beneath a mountain of Allied progress, unable to keep up, unable to understand how it had all slipped away. Inside bunkers across occupied Europe, German radar officers sat staring at their Würzburg and Freya screens, the same green glowing scopes that had once guided their interceptors to victory. But now they flickered with phantoms. On the night of June 5, 1944, these scopes erupted in chaos. The skies above the French coast were alive with radar echoes, hundreds of them, suggesting massive formations of bombers and landing craft moving toward the Pas de Calais. Panic spread through Luftwaffe command. Fighters scrambled, artillery units prepared, and coastal batteries locked on to their radar contacts. But when dawn broke, there was nothing. The invasion wasn't at Calais. It was 100 miles away, at Normandy. The Allies had pulled off the most successful radar deception in history. Using a mix of electronic jamming, radar-reflecting balloons, Operation Glimmer and Taxable, and dummy landing craft, they created an illusion so convincing that German analysts refused to believe it was fake, even after the first Allied troops stormed the real beaches. For nearly 48 hours, Hitler's elite armored divisions stayed immobilized in Calais, waiting for a phantom army that never arrived. By the time they realized the truth, the Allies had already broken through the Atlantic Wall. Radar, once Germany's shield, had become its blindfold. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's night fighter force, the Nachtjagd, was collapsing from within. Its pilots, the once feared hunters of the night, now faced an invisible enemy they couldn't track. The Americans' radar countermeasures grew more sophisticated every month. Carpet and mandrel jammers flooded German radar frequencies with noise. Monica tail warning radars baited German fighters into ambushes. Boozer receivers told Allied pilots when they were being tracked, giving them precious seconds to evade. Every advantage the Luftwaffe once held was slipping through its fingers. German scientists tried to respond with desperate improvisations. They created Naxos, a radar detector meant to locate Allied H-2S radar emissions, allowing fighters to home in on bombers. For a few weeks, it worked, until the Allies changed frequencies. Then came Klein-Heidelberg, a bizarre attempt to steal signals from British radar stations and use them to triangulate bomber positions. But the system was unreliable and painfully slow. By the time it identified a formation, the bombers had already dropped their payloads and vanished. The Germans were now chasing ghosts made of radio waves. By the autumn of 1944, the radar imbalance had become catastrophic.
Allied H-2X-equipped bombers guided entire formations through solid cloud cover, hitting oil plants in Luna, Merschurberg, and Bolin with precision that stunned German commanders. The Luftwaffe, grounded by fuel shortages, could barely take off. When radar-guided P-61 Black Widows began patrolling German airspace at night, even the most experienced German aces feared the dark. They called them the Invisible Hunters. In October 1944, over the Rhine, a German Luftwaffe pilot radioed a chilling final message before disappearing from radar. "They see us, but we can't see them." His plane was never found. In one last act of desperation, German engineers proposed anti-radar coatings for aircraft, using graphite paint and wood composites to absorb radio waves. Early experiments in what we now call stealth. But it was far too late. The factories were bombed, the research fragmented, and the resources gone. The radar war was no longer about who could build the best machine. It was about who could still build at all. By early 1945, Germany's once mighty radar chain lay in ruins. Allied bombing had destroyed hundreds of stations. The survivors operated under constant jamming. The Luftwaffe's radar operators reported seeing entire fleets vanish and reappear in seconds, ghosts dancing on their screens. As the Allies advanced into Germany, soldiers discovered just how advanced American radar had become. Mobile radar units on trucks tracked targets hundreds of miles away. Field operators guided artillery fire with precision unseen in any previous war. And as Berlin crumbled, one German radar officer summed up the defeat in a single line to his British captors. "We thought radar would make us gods. Instead, it made us blind." By the war's end, the numbers told the story. Over 70% of U-boat losses after 1943 were due to radar detection. The Luftwaffe's night fighter kill ratio plummeted from 5-1 to less than 1-3. Allied bombing accuracy improved by more than 60% through radar mapping. The same scientists who had once dismissed American crude radar now stood in awe and horror as they studied captured sets like the SCR-584 and H-2X. One German engineer whispered to his colleague, "They turned the invisible into a weapon." The final irony was bitter. Germany had invented much of the early radar theory. Hertz, Brown, and Kuhn had all laid its foundations. But when it came to war, the Americans and British had done what the Germans could not: turn equations into dominance. By 1945, radar had reshaped the battlefield, the seas, and the very concept of warfare itself. It didn't just detect enemies, it decided the future. And as the Reich collapsed, the laughter that had once filled Luftwaffe mess halls over American radar was replaced by silence, broken only by the distant hum of Allied planes they could no longer see.
When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the radar war didn't end, it merely changed shape. Across the shattered remains of Europe, Allied scientific teams began Operation Surgeon and Operation Lusty, missions to seize every radar, radio, and guidance system the Germans had left behind. From underground bunkers to crumbling airfields, they unearthed a technological graveyard. Stacks of Lichtenstein radar sets, fragments of Würzburg dishes, and half-finished prototypes of strange new systems that had never seen combat. The Allies were astonished. Despite the chaos, German scientists had been experimenting with concepts far ahead of their time: millimeter wave radar, passive detection, even infrared target tracking. But the war had come too fast,
too violently. Germany had the ideas, but not the time, nor the industrial depth to turn them into dominance. American engineers packed crates of components and blueprints and shipped them back to laboratories in New Jersey, Massachusetts, and California. The same happened in Britain, where the Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE, at Malvern, began dissecting German devices alongside their own. Each discovery revealed the same truth. Radar had decided the war long before the tanks and bombers did. In Washington and London, reports began to circulate, calm, technical, and chillingly clear. A secret U.S. Navy analysis concluded, the electromagnetic battlefield proved decisive. Whoever controlled the invisible spectrum controlled the outcome of every engagement. This understanding would soon redefine global power. The American SCR-584 radar, once used to guide anti-aircraft fire over Normandy, evolved into the blueprint for post-war air defense networks. The same principles behind H-2X radar mapping became the foundation of early guided missile systems and weather radar. Even more significant was what radar had taught humanity, that technology could no longer be confined to the laboratory. It had become a weapon of destiny. The Germans, now defeated and divided, faced a grim fate. Many of their leading radar scientists were quietly recruited by both East and West. Under Operation Paperclip, dozens were taken to the United States, not for punishment, but for potential. One of them, Dr. Hans Hallmann, whose early work had shaped Germany's microwave radar research, would later contribute to civilian communications technologies. Another, Dr. Heinz Schlick, helped American engineers refine jamming and countermeasure techniques that would become vital during the Korean War. Meanwhile, Soviet forces scoured eastern Germany, seizing radar facilities in Peenemünde, Rechlin, and Oranienburg. Entire teams of German engineers were transported to the USSR to accelerate the development of Soviet early warning systems. Radar had become the new currency of power, and both sides wanted to own it. For the soldiers and pilots who had lived through the radar war, the aftermath felt haunting. Veterans of the Luftwaffe knockjogged, once proud, now broken, spoke of the silence in the headphones, the moment when the familiar blip disappeared, replaced by chaos. They realized too late that technology had outpaced courage. American bomber crews who had once flown blind through storms of flak now flew above the clouds with confidence, not guided by sight, but by pulses of invisible energy. To them, radar wasn't just a tool, it was a shield, a miracle of the mind that turned fear into precision. In 1946, as Europe began to rebuild, radar laboratories flourished across the United States and Britain. The lessons of war birthed peacetime revolutions, from civil aviation safety to maritime navigation, and even the first steps towards space observation. Yet beneath this optimism, a darker realization was spreading. If radar could see everything, it could also guide anything, including missiles. By 1949, both the US and the Soviet Union were developing radar-guided air defense systems capable of tracking atomic bombers. The radar curtain, first built to protect against Luftwaffe raids, now encircled the world as a symbol of a new kind of war, one fought not in the skies, but in the invisible spectrum of detection and deception. Radar had survived the war, but its future would be far more dangerous.
The radar revolution that began in the chaos of World War II did not fade with victory. It multiplied. By the late 1940s, the same American and British scientists who had perfected radar during the war now turned their focus to a new, invisible enemy, the atomic bomber. The Cold War was beginning, and radar would become its nervous system. In 1948, engineers at MIT's Radiation Laboratory and the newly formed Air Defense Command began developing a concept no one had dared imagine during the war: a global radar shield. The idea was simple, yet audacious: to build a network of long-range radar stations that could detect Soviet bombers hours before they reached North America. By 1957, this idea had become reality in the form of the Distant Early Warning Line, DU line, a chain of radar outposts stretching from Alaska across the Arctic to Greenland and Iceland. Manned by technicians who endured months of darkness and ice, the DU line transformed radar from a battlefield instrument into the guardian of civilization itself. Each blip on those screens carried existential weight. A mistake could trigger a war that ended humanity. The technology born from the German-American radar war had evolved into something vast and omnipresent. The same principles behind the SCR-584 and Würzburg had birthed phased array radars, digital displays, and automatic tracking, the building blocks of modern surveillance. Ironically, both superpowers used captured German research to accelerate these systems. In Moscow, the Soviet Union developed its own radar warning networks, the PVO Strony, or Air Defense of the Homeland. In Washington, radar operators trained with devices built from both Allied and Axis blueprints. The old adversary's technology was now protecting both sides from each other. Meanwhile, radar was reshaping civilian life in ways the Luftwaffe's officers could never have imagined. In airports across the world, air traffic controllers guided planes safely through fog and darkness using civilian radar derivatives of wartime models. At sea, radar-equipped ships navigated through storms with confidence once thought impossible. Even meteorologists began using radar to track rainfall, an echo of H2X's once deadly precision turned toward saving lives instead of ending them. The instrument that had blinded Germany now saw everything. But the Cold War also brought back the same cycle of innovation and deception that had defined the 1940s. By the 1960s, as jet bombers gave way to intercontinental ballistic missiles, radar faced its next great challenge: detecting objects that moved too fast, too high, and too small for traditional systems. New radar arrays like BMEWS, Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, were built in Greenland, Alaska, and Scotland. These could track missiles launched from halfway around the world in minutes. Once again, radar dictated who lived and who died, not through battle, but through deterrence. A silent guardian ensuring that neither side dared strike first. Behind the polished reports and glowing screens, however, veterans of the original radar war often reflected on the irony of it all. Men who had once watched their scopes in 1943 now trained new generations of radar operators, this time not to fight, but to wait. One British veteran wrote in 1955, "We once feared the night because radar made killing so easy. Now we fear the day it will make ending the world just as easy." By the late 19th century, radar had transcended warfare entirely. From space-borne synthetic aperture radar mapping entire continents, to police speed detectors, weather satellites, and even the systems guiding self-landing aircraft, it had become an invisible backbone of modern civilization. Yet buried within that triumph was the echo of its origin. The laughter of German officers mocking American radar in 1943 had faded into the hum of global surveillance networks that watched every movement, every signal, every skog. The night that once belonged to the Luftwaffe's hunters now belonged to the machines. And somewhere in that transformation, between fear, innovation, and control, the radar had changed humanity itself. As one American radar pioneer later reflected at a Cold War symposium, "We thought radar would end wars by making surprise impossible. Instead, it made the world permanently awake."
The story of radar is not merely of science or strategy, it is a story of perception. It taught mankind to see the unseen, to measure the invisible, to control the chaos of the night. Yet in doing so, it also revealed something deeper, that every leap in human vision comes at a cost. During the early years of the war, radar was born from fear. Fear of the unknown skies, of enemy bombers in the dark, of losing control. It gave humanity a new kind of sight, one that pierced clouds, distance, and even deception. But that same sight soon became an obsession, a race to master every frequency, to dominate the very air itself. The Germans had laughed at American radar because they could not imagine war fought in pure abstraction, with waves instead of bullets, silence instead of sound. They saw technology as an extension of courage, not as a replacement for it. But the Americans and their allies understood that the battlefield of the future would be invisible. That realization changed everything. Radar became more than a weapon. It became a mirror, reflecting the human desire to know, to predict, to control. From the dark skies of 1943 to the cold screens of the DU line, it shaped how nations watched one another, how they feared one another, and ultimately how they avoided annihilation. What began as an instrument to hunt bombers became the nervous system of a planet that could never sleep again. Today, radar pulses silently from satellites, aircraft, ships, and cities, still watching, still guarding. Most who depend on it have forgotten where it came from or how many lives were claimed before its promise was fulfilled. But the lesson remains. Victory belongs not to those who see first, but to those who understand what they're seeing. And on that night in 1943, when German officers laughed at American radar, they didn't just misjudge a machine. They misjudged a revolution that would turn the night sky into humanity's most powerful weapon and its most haunting reflection.